Dear Father Christmas, please send me a father. The letter, written in a shaky hand, landed right on the desk of a lonely millionaire. He read each line in silence, and in that instant, something inside him simply changed. Support the channel by leaving your like and comment. And let's get to our story. Adebayo Adeleke watched the distorted reflection of the Christmas lights on the windows of the building opposite, while his fingers drummed on the mahogany desk. It was almost 10 p.m. on a Friday, and the office on the 23rd floor remained empty, silent, just the hum of the air conditioner filling the space between him and his thoughts. There was something ironic about being alone, precisely at the time of year when everyone seemed to have someone waiting at home. Adebayo had no one, not waiting, not demanding, not missing him. This was exactly how he had organized his life for the past 5 years, since the divorce that felt more like a business agreement than the end of a marriage. Perhaps it had always been a business agreement. Perhaps he never knew how to tell the difference. He picked up the cup of cold coffee next to his laptop and took a distracted sip, making a face. The financial report for the last quarter was open on the screen, impressive numbers that should have brought him some satisfaction. His tech company had grown by 40% that year, surpassing the most optimistic projections. Adebayo Adeleke was the kind of name that appeared on the covers of business magazines that young, successful, envied entrepreneur. But there, in that heavy December silence, he wondered what it was all for. For whom was he building this empire? The answer was simple and uncomfortable. For no one, just for himself. And was that enough? It used to be. Lately, he wasn't so sure. Adebayo pushed his chair back and stood up, walking to the window. Lagos glittered below, a constellation of yellow, red, and white lights, stretching as far as the eye could see. Millions of people, millions of stories happening simultaneously, and he was there, suspended above it all, observing without participating. His phone vibrated on the desk. It was Emeka, his business partner and the only friend, who still insisted on including him in things. We're having a get-together at the house tomorrow. Show your face. The children were asking about you. Adebayo typed an automatic reply, a ready-made excuse about accumulated work. It wasn't a lie. It never was. But it wasn't the real reason either. The truth was, he no longer knew how to be among people without feeling like an imposter, someone just playing the role of a functional human, while something inside him remained switched off. He returned to the desk, determined to finish up and go home, or to the apartment he called home, but which felt more like a showroom from an interior design magazine. That was when he noticed a pile of envelopes that Funke, his personal assistant, had left there in the morning. Miscellaneous correspondence, documents awaiting his signature, invitations to events he would probably decline. Adebayo began to flick through them mechanically, separating what needed immediate attention from what could wait. It was then that a smaller, crumpled envelope fell from between the papers and slid across the polished surface of the desk. He frowned. That didn't look like a corporate document. The paper was simple, almost childish, with a hand-drawn Christmas tree in the top corner. Adebayo picked up the envelope with curiosity. There was no sender, just an address written with exaggerated neatness, in what was clearly a child's handwriting, to Father Christmas. He turned the envelope over in his hands, not understanding how it had ended up there. Maybe it was from an employee's child. Maybe it had gotten mixed in with the documents by mistake. He should just give it back to Funke on Monday and forget about it. But there was something in the simplicity of that envelope, in the innocence of the crooked drawing, that made him hesitate. Before he could rationalize it, Adebayo tore open the side and pulled out a folded sheet from a school notebook. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, each word written with visible effort, some letters bigger than others, as if the child was still learning to master writing. Dear Father Christmas, my name is Adana, and I am 7 years old. I know you are very busy and have to take presents to many children. I don't want toys this year. My mummy works very hard and gets tired. She says I am the biggest present she could ever have, but I see that she gets sad sometimes, especially when the other children at school talk about their fathers. I don't have a father. My mummy says he went away before I was born. Please, Father Christmas, can you send me a father? He doesn't have to be perfect. He just has to like us. One who will stay. Thank you, Adana. Adebayo read the letter once, then read it again, and once more. Each word seemed to pierce something inside him that had long been anesthetized. He looked at the drawing at the end of the letter. 3 stick figures. A woman, a little girl, and an empty space beside them where a man should have been. Adana had drawn a question mark in that space. The brutal simplicity of that request hit him with a force he hadn't expected. A 7-year-old child asking for a father for Christmas. Not a toy, not clothes, not sweets. A father. Someone who would stay. Adebayo sat down again, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. When was the last time something had touched him like this? When was the last time he had felt anything other than tiredness and emptiness? He couldn't say how long he sat there, just staring at those words written with childish hope. The office around him seemed to have disappeared. There was only him and that letter, that impossible request from a little girl named Adana. Adebayo found himself wondering who she was, what her routine was like, her school, her home. He thought of the mother, working to exhaustion, raising her daughter alone, carrying the weight of being everything to that child all by herself. He knew abandonment, he knew absence. His own father had been a cold man, more interested in his business than his family. Adebayo had sworn to himself he would never be like that, and so he had ensured he would be nothing at all by simply avoiding having any family. What difference did it make? In the end, both resulted in emptiness. His father had chosen to be absent even while being present. Adebayo had chosen complete absence. He looked at the envelope again, turning it over in search of some clue, some information about how it had reached him. Nothing. Just the fanciful address to Father Christmas and the drawing of a tree. How had that letter ended up on his desk? It was impossible for it to be a coincidence, but at the same time, it made no sense at all. Adebayo stood up abruptly, feeling a restlessness he hadn't experienced in years. He had to know. He had to find out who Adana was, how that letter had reached him, what it all meant. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was just the absurd randomness of life. But Adebayo didn't believe in randomness. He believed in patterns, in logic, in causality. And there was something about this situation that completely defied any logic he knew. He took his phone and photographed the letter, the envelope, the drawing. He put everything carefully into a folder he took from his drawer. On Monday, he would talk to Funke, investigate how it had arrived at the office, trace its origin. But as he turned off the lights and called the lift, Adebayo knew something had changed. He couldn't name exactly what, but it was as if that simple request from an unknown child had cracked something inside him. And through that narrow crack, an uncomfortable light was beginning to enter, illuminating corners he had preferred to keep in the shadows. Adebayo entered the lift, pressing the button for the ground floor. His reflection in the mirror showed a man in an impeccable suit, with the appearance of someone who has everything under control. But his eyes betrayed something different. There was a question there, a restlessness, an awakening. As the lift descended through the floors, Adebayo mentally reread every word of the letter. He doesn't have to be perfect. He just has to like us. One who will stay. The simplicity of that request was devastating. Adana wasn't asking for luxury. She wasn't asking for wealth. She wasn't asking for a hero. She was just asking for someone. Someone who would stay. Adebayo thought of how many people in his life had left. His mother, who passed away when he was 15. His father, emotionally absent until his death. His ex-wife, who left without a backward glance. Himself, who had departed from his own self at some point along the way. How many times had Adebayo been the one who didn't stay? How many opportunities for genuine connection had he let slip by because it was easier, safer, more controllable to be alone? The lift stopped on the ground floor with a slight jolt. The doors opened, revealing the empty lobby of the building, with only the night security guard waving from a distance. Adebayo returned the gesture automatically and walked towards the exit. The cool December air of Lagos hit him as soon as he passed through the revolving doors. It wasn't the biting harmattan of the north, but that humid Lagos chill that caught you off guard on a breezy night. Adebayo stuck his hands in his suit, jacket pockets, and began walking towards the car park. But his thoughts remained stuck on that letter, on that girl, on that request that seemed directed not at Father Christmas, but directly at him. It was absurd, it was irrational, but Adebayo couldn't shake the feeling that the letter hadn't reached him by chance. And more importantly, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something about it. As he drove through the deserted streets towards his empty apartment, Adebayo made a decision. He would find Adana. He would find out how that letter had reached him. And then he didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, Adebayo Adeleke felt something other than constant emptiness. He felt curiosity. He felt urgency. He felt perhaps a glimmer of what he had once called purpose. And that, as frightening as it was also strangely liberating. Adana's letter rested on the passenger seat, and Adebayo glanced at it as he stopped at a red light. One who will stay, he repeated mentally. Maybe it was time for him to learn how to stay himself, learn not to run away, learn that there was something beyond the numbers, the achievements, the comfortable void he had built around himself. The light turned green. Adebayo accelerated, and as the city lights blurred around him, he knew that this December night had marked something, a before and an after. The letter from a 7-year-old girl had just changed the trajectory of a 8-year-old man who thought he had already walked every possible path in his life. The weekend dragged on with cruel slowness. Adebayo tried to immerse himself in reports, review contracts, anything to occupy his mind and push away the insistent thought of that letter. It didn't work. On Saturday morning, he found himself rereading Adana's words for the 10th time, his fingers tracing the outline of the childish drawing. He tried to watch a football match but turned off the television at halftime, unable to concentrate. He ordered food via an app and ate without tasting it, his eyes repeatedly returning to the folder where he had kept the letter. In the evening, he accepted Emeka's invitation to the get-together just to escape from himself, but he only stayed for an hour, uncomfortable with the domestic happiness that overflowed from that house, full of children's laughter and trivial conversations about school and holiday planning. Sunday dawned gray, threatening rain. Adebayo woke up early, despite having slept poorly. Confused dreams populated by flying letters and children's voices, calling for someone who didn't appear. He made strong coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, determined to start his investigation. Where to begin? The letter had no return address, no concrete clues other than the name Adana and her age. Adebayo thought about hiring a private investigator, but that seemed excessive, even invasive. He wanted answers, but he didn't want to frighten the girl or her mother. He needed subtlety, a way that didn't feel like an intrusion into their lives. But what way was that? Adebayo had no idea. It was then that he remembered Funke. She would be the key. The letter had arrived mixed in with the documents his assistant had left on his desk. Funke was meticulous, organized to an extreme. If something unusual had passed through her hands, she would know, or at least have some clue. Adebayo looked at the clock, 8:30 on a Sunday morning, too early to call. He would have to wait until Monday. The idea of another full day of waiting irritated him deeply. Adebayo was not used to waiting. He was used to acting, to solving, to controlling. But this situation was completely out of his control, and it left him restless in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He decided to go for a run. Perhaps the exercise would help calm his growing anxiety. He quickly changed his clothes and went down to the ground floor. Crossing the luxurious lobby of the building where he lived, the concierge greeted him with the same professional smile as always. Adebayo returned the greeting mechanically and went out into the street. The air was humid, heavy, typical of Lagos before the rain. He started running along the Lekki-Ikoyi link bridge, his strides finding a steady rhythm, while his mind continued to spin around the same question. Why did that letter affect him so much? Why couldn't he just forget it, file it away as a curiosity and move on? Adebayo had no answers. He only knew that something in those simple words resonated in a part of him he thought was dead. As he ran, he observed families strolling, children riding bicycles, couples holding hands. There was a lightness in those scenes that Adebayo hadn't felt in so long he couldn't even remember what it was like. His life was made of meetings, negotiations, achievements that sounded hollow when he was alone. He had money, success, recognition, but he had no one to share any of it with. What was worse, he had convinced himself that he didn't need to, that this chosen solitude was freedom, was strength. But looking at those ordinary people, living their ordinary lives, Adebayo began to question whether he had been fooling himself all along, whether what he called freedom was just fear disguised as choice. He returned home an hour later, sweaty and tired, but no calmer. He took a long shower, letting the hot water run down his tense back, while he thought about what he would say to Funke on Monday, how to explain his sudden interest in a child's letter, how not to seem strange, invasive. Adebayo mentally rehearsed a few approaches, discarding all of them. In the end, he decided to be direct. Funke had been working with him for 6 years. She knew his objective nature. He would be honest about finding the letter and wanting to understand how it had reached him. Simple as that. Without needing to explain the reason for his interest, without needing to justify the restlessness he couldn't name. The rest of Sunday dragged on in a combination of frustrated attempts to work and repeated glances at the letter. Adebayo tried to read, but the words danced on the page without making sense. He tried to watch a film but turned it off after 20 minutes. He was restless, impatient, counting the hours until Monday. In the evening, he prepared a simple dinner that he barely touched, the food turning into a weight in his stomach. He looked out of the apartment window, the lights of Lagos twinkling in the distance, as they always did, indifferent to the turmoil inside him. Adebayo realized he was afraid, not of what he might discover about Adana and her mother, but of what that discovery might reveal about himself. Monday dawned with a clear sky that contrasted with Adebayo's internal agitation. He arrived at the office at 7 a.m., 2 hours before his usual time. The building was almost empty, with just a few cleaning staff and security guards. Adebayo went up to his floor and locked himself in his office, unable to do anything but wait for Funke to arrive. He tried to answer emails but gave up after typing and deleting the same sentence 3 times. The clock on the wall seemed to move in slow motion. 8 a.m., 8:15, 8:30. Funke always arrived punctually at 9. Adebayo had never realized how long half an hour could last. At 9 o'clock sharp, he heard Funke's voice greeting someone in the corridor. Adebayo stood up immediately, then sat down again, trying to look casual. He didn't want to scare her with his inexplicable anxiety. Light knocks on the door. Funke entered with her usual efficiency, tablet in hand, already starting to list the day's appointments. Adebayo interrupted her before she finished the first sentence. "Funke, I need to ask you about something I found on my desk on Friday." She raised her eyebrows, curious. "Of course, Mr. Adebayo. Is there a problem with the documents?" Adebayo shook his head, picking up the folder where he had kept the letter. Not exactly a problem, but a curiosity. He took out the envelope and handed it to Funke. She took it, examined it, and her face immediately changed. An expression of surprise and something like embarrassment took over. "Oh my God, I can't believe I let this get in there. I'm so sorry, Mr. Adebayo. Adebayo raised his hand, interrupting. "You don't need to apologize. I just need to understand how this letter got here." Funke sighed, still holding the envelope. "It was a silly mistake on my part. On Friday morning, I brought my niece to the office because her school had a plumbing problem, and they released the children early. My sister was at work and asked me to pick her up. I let her stay here in the reception area for a few hours until I could take her home." Adebayo nodded, beginning to understand. "And the letter?" Funke blushed slightly. "Adana, she's very well behaved. She sat quietly, drawing and writing. She showed me the letter she was making for Father Christmas. I thought it was so sweet that I kept it to read later, but I ended up putting it in the middle of the documents by mistake when I was organizing things to leave on your desk. I only realized the error late in the afternoon, but you had already left and She hesitated. "I kind of forgot about it over the weekend. I'm really sorry." Adebayo felt something tighten in his chest. Adana wasn't a stranger. She was Funke's niece. The connection was closer than he had imagined. "Your niece," he repeated, processing. "Does she live here in Lagos?" Funke nodded. "Yes, on the mainland. My sister, Chinelo, is raising Adana on her own. It's complicated. Adana's father abandoned my sister when he found out she was pregnant, completely disappeared, never wanted to know about the child. Chinelo works as a teacher in a public primary school, does what she can, but it's hard raising a child alone. You know how it is." Adebayo knew, or at least he was beginning to understand. "Are you close to them?" Funke smiled with genuine affection. "Very. Adana is like a daughter to me too. I spend every weekend with them. I help where I can. My sister is proud, doesn't like to accept financial help, but I find ways to contribute without making it seem like I'm giving her handouts. You know?" Adebayo nodded slowly, absorbing every piece of information. Chinelo, a teacher, a single mother, proud, and Adana, 7 years old, writing letters to Father Christmas asking for a father. The picture was becoming clearer, more real, more painfully human. He looked at Funke, who was still holding the letter carefully, as if it was something precious. "Can I ask a strange question?" Funke blinked, confused. "Of course." Adebayo took a deep breath. "Does Adana really have no father figure in her life? No one besides you and your sister?" Funke shook her head sadly. "Our father passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. It was very hard for all of us, but especially for Adana. She was very attached to her grandfather. After he was gone, it was just the 3 of us, Chinelo, me, and Adana." Adebayo was silent for a long moment, looking at the letter that now had faces, names, stories. It was no longer just an abstract request from an unknown child. It was Adana, Funke's niece, Chinelo's daughter, the granddaughter of a man who had passed away, leaving a void. It was real, it was close, it was impossible to ignore. He looked at Funke and, before he could think too much, said, "I would like to meet them, Adana and Chinelo. If that's possible." Funke's eyes widened. clearly surprised. Meet them? Why? Adebayo didn't have a rational answer. He only had the simple, inadequate truth. Because I need to. Funke studied him for a long moment, something changing in her expression. Then she smiled, a small but genuine smile. Let me talk to my sister first. Chinelo is complicated with strangers, especially men, but I'll figure something out. Adebayo nodded, feeling something like hope for the first time in years. 3 days passed in a kind of anxious limbo. Funke had said she needed to find the right moment to talk to Chinelo, that it wouldn't be simple to explain the situation without sounding invasive or strange. Adebayo tried to respect the process, but every hour of waiting seemed to drag on endlessly. He found himself checking his phone every 5 minutes, hoping for a message from Funke saying everything was arranged. Nothing came. On Wednesday afternoon, when Adebayo was already considering giving up on the whole absurd idea, Funke finally knocked on his office door with a cautious expression. Oga, I managed to speak with my sister. Adebayo looked up from his computer immediately, his heart speeding up in a way that made no sense. Funke came in and closed the door behind her, a sign that the conversation was delicate. Chinelo was suspicious, as I imagined. She doesn't understand why a stranger, my boss of all people, wants to meet her daughter. I was honest about the letter, about how you were touched by Adana's request. But Chinelo, she hesitated, choosing her words. She has reasons to be wary of men, sir. Adana's father wasn't just absent, he was cruel. He said terrible things when he found out about the pregnancy, accused my sister of trying to trap him, of ruining his life. Chinelo was 24, just starting her career as a teacher, and suddenly she found herself alone, pregnant, and being told she was a mistake, a burden. That marks a person. Adebayo felt anger rise within him. Anger at that cowardly man who had abandoned Chinelo and Adana. Anger at all the men who did that and got away with it. I understand, he said, controlling his tone. And what did she decide? Funke sighed. She agreed to meet you, but with conditions. Adebayo nodded, waiting. First condition. The meeting needs to be casual, natural, nothing formal, nothing that would make Adana uncomfortable or suspicious. Second condition. If at any moment Chinelo feels you are not who you say you are, or that your intentions are not genuine, she will leave, and you will never approach them again. Third condition. You do not mention money, financial help, or anything that sounds like pity. Adebayo processed each condition carefully. They all made sense. They all protected Adana and Chinelo from possible disappointment or manipulation. I accept all the conditions, he said without hesitation. So how are we going to do this? Funke pulled out her phone and showed him a message. On Saturday, there's a Christmas party at the school where Chinelo works. It's open to the community. There are presentations by the children, local food, that sort of thing. Adana is going to perform in the children's choir. Chinelo suggested you show up as my guest, someone I brought to see what a public school environment is like, since you have that corporate social responsibility project for the company. Adebayo raised an eyebrow. He had no corporate social responsibility project. Funke noticed his confusion and smiled. I know you don't, but Chinelo doesn't know that, and it will be a plausible excuse for you to be there. Adebayo should have felt uncomfortable with the lie, but strangely, he didn't. If this was what he had to do to meet Adana and Chinelo without scaring them, then he would do it. What time? Funke consulted her phone again. The party starts at 3 p.m. The choir performance is at 4. I suggest we arrive at 3:30, so you have time to get settled before. Adebayo nodded, already mentally rearranging his Saturday schedule. He had a lunch meeting with investors that he would have to cancel. He didn't mind one bit. I'll be ready. Funke studied him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was curiosity there, perhaps hope, definitely protectiveness. Sir, can I speak frankly? Adebayo gestured for her to continue. Always. I've worked with you for 6 years. I have never seen you show interest in anything other than work. I've never seen you leave the office before 8 p.m. I've never heard you talk about friends, family, hobbies. Sir, you are the loneliest man I know, and that's not a criticism, it's an observation. She paused as if weighing her next words. I don't know what that letter awakened in you, but I need you to know that my niece is not a project. She is not a way for you to fill a void or feel better about yourself. She is a real child, with real feelings, who has already suffered enough rejection for a lifetime. If you are not absolutely sure that you can be present, that you won't disappear when this is no longer new, then I would rather you give up now. The silence that followed was dense. Adebayo was not offended. Funke was right to be protective, right to question him. He himself wasn't sure of anything. He couldn't explain why that letter had affected him so much. He couldn't predict whether this urgent need to meet Adana and Chinelo was just a temporary impulse. But he knew one thing. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. And that had to mean something. "I don't know what will happen, Funke," he said honestly. "I don't know if I'm capable of being what Adana needs. I don't even know if Chinelo will tolerate me for more than 5 minutes. But I know I have to try. I know that if I do nothing, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what if, and I'm tired of living only on unanswered questions." Funke watched him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if you hurt them, I will personally make sure you regret it." There was no empty threat in those words, only raw truth. Adebayo smiled for the first time in the conversation. Fair enough. Funke stood up to leave, but stopped at the door and turned around. "One last thing. Wear something casual on Saturday. No suits. You'll be at a public school on the mainland, not a shareholders' meeting." Adebayo looked down at the Armani suit he was wearing and almost laughed. When was the last time he had worn something casual? He wasn't even sure he still owned clothes that weren't formal. "I'll sort something out." After Funke left, Adebayo was alone with his thoughts again. He looked at the calendar on his computer screen. 3 days until Saturday. 3 days to prepare to meet a woman and a child who had somehow already changed something inside him without even knowing of his existence. Adebayo found himself imagining what Chinelo would be like. Funke had said she was wary, scarred by abandonment. Adebayo understood distrust. He lived surrounded by it. But would he be able to break through that barrier? Would Chinelo see in him anything other than a rich, bored man looking for entertainment? And Adana, what would it be like to look at the girl who had written those simple, devastating words? Adebayo had no experience with children. He had no nieces or nephews, no godchildren. He avoided social events where children were present. But there was something in the brutal honesty of that request that drew him in. He doesn't have to be perfect, he just has to like us. One who will stay. Adana wasn't asking for the impossible. She wasn't asking for a hero. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was asking for presence, consistency, genuine affection. And Adebayo, who had spent his life thinking he was incapable of offering those things, now wondered if he was wrong. If maybe, just maybe, he could be enough for someone. Not Adebayo Adeleke, the successful entrepreneur. Just Adebayo, the man who had once dreamed of family, of real connections, before convincing himself that those things were not for him. On Thursday, Adebayo did something he hadn't done in years. He left the office early, went to a shopping mall, and spent 2 hours in clothing stores trying to find something that looked casual but not sloppy, approachable but not forced. He ended up buying dark jeans, a simple white shirt, and a brown leather jacket. The sales assistant tried to push expensive imported trainers on him, but Adebayo refused and chose a simpler model. Looking at himself in the fitting room mirror, Adebayo barely recognized himself. Without the suit, without the tie, without the corporate armor, he looked younger, more approachable, more human. He liked what he saw, or at least he didn't hate it. Friday was the longest day of the week. Adebayo tried to work, but his mind was completely elsewhere. Funke passed by his office a few times, always with that appraising look, as if trying to decide if he was making the right decision or a terrible mistake. Adebayo didn't blame her hesitation. He himself was oscillating between excitement and dread. What if Chinelo hated him on sight? What if Adana found him scary? What if he said the wrong thing, did something inappropriate? Adebayo was used to controlling situations, to predicting outcomes, to always having a plan. But here he was completely in the dark, and strangely, that didn't terrify him as much as it should have. At night, lying in bed in his silent apartment, Adebayo reread Adana's letter one more time. The words were already memorized, but he needed that physical contact with the paper, with the childish handwriting, with the drawing of the 3 stick figures. Tomorrow he would meet the girl behind those words. He would meet the mother who was raising that child alone, with a courage and strength Adebayo could only imagine. And then he didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, Adebayo Adeleke was willing not to know. He was willing to just let things happen without total control, without guarantees. It was terrifying, it was liberating, it was necessary. He carefully folded the letter and put it back in the folder. Tomorrow, something new would begin, something he couldn't name but felt was important. Maybe Adana's letter hadn't reached him by chance. Maybe it was exactly where it needed to arrive. And maybe Adebayo was exactly who needed to find it. Saturday dawned with a shy sun that struggled to break through the thick clouds. Adebayo woke up at 6 a.m., 2 hours before his alarm. his stomach in knots with anxiety. He tried to have breakfast, but the food felt like paper in his mouth. He took a long shower, changed his clothes 3 times, before finally settling on the combination he had bought. He looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the man staring back at him. Without the armor of his suit, he looked vulnerable, exposed. It was exactly how he felt. Funke called at noon to confirm they would meet at the school gate at 3:30. Adebayo agreed, his voice coming out more tense than he intended. The next few hours dragged by in a slow agony. At 3 p.m., Adebayo was already in his car, driving towards the Lagos mainland. The traffic was surprisingly light for a Saturday, and he reached the neighborhood with 20 minutes to spare. He parked 2 streets away from the school, deciding to walk to calm his nerves. The area was completely different from the world Adebayo lived in. Simple houses packed tightly together, colorful walls, children playing on the street, the sound of Afrobeats leaking from an open window. There was life there, a pulsating energy that contrasted with the sterilized silence of his luxury estate in Lekki. Adebayo observed everything with an almost painful attention, trying to absorb this universe that was completely foreign to him. The school was an old but well-maintained building, with walls painted a pale yellow and a green gate, where a small queue of families was already forming to enter. There were colorful balloons decorating the entrance, and a makeshift banner wishing everyone a Merry Christmas. Adebayo saw Funke from a distance, talking to a tall woman with brown hair tied back in a ponytail. Even from afar, he knew immediately it was Chinelo. There was something in her posture, in the way she kept her arms defensively crossed, that conveyed caution. Adebayo took a deep breath and walked towards them. Funke saw him first and waved. Chinelo turned, and her eyes met Adebayo's for the first time. Chinelo Ferreira was not what Adebayo had expected. He had imagined someone marked by hardship, downcast, perhaps bitter. But the woman who faced him had intense brown eyes and a natural beauty that no amount of tiredness had managed to completely erase. She was tall, almost Adebayo's height, with delicate features but a firm expression. She wore a simple, floral cotton dress and flat sandals, her hair shining in the sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. There was strength there, a silent determination that Adebayo recognized and respected immediately. Chinelo didn't smile when he approached, just nodded slightly. Appraisingly, Adebayo extended his hand. "Chinelo, I'm Adebayo. It's a pleasure to meet you." Chinelo shook his hand briefly, the touch firm but distant. "Funke told me about you." "About the letter." Adebayo nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. What would he say? How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? "I know this must seem strange," he began, choosing each word carefully. "A stranger wanting to meet your daughter because of a letter that reached me by chance. But I was touched by what Adana wrote, and I felt I had to at least meet her. To understand." Chinelo studied him in silence for a long moment. "Do you have children, Adebayo?" The question caught him off guard. "No, I've never had any." Chinelo nodded slowly. "Then you don't know what it's like to be in my place. You don't know what it's like to raise a child alone, to see her asking why all the other children have fathers and she doesn't. You don't know how devastating it is when the school has Father's Day, and you have to be both things at once." Chinelo's voice was controlled, but Adebayo could hear the pain beneath the words. "You're right. I don't know. I can't pretend to fully understand what you've been through, but I can try to learn, if you'll let me." Chinelo crossed her arms again, the defensive posture returning. "Why? Why would a man like you care about a public school teacher and her daughter? What do you get out of this?" It was a fair question. Brutal, but fair. Adebayo could have lied, invented some noble excuse, but he decided on honesty. "Nothing. I get nothing. Maybe I'll waste my time. Maybe I'll expose myself to feelings I've spent years avoiding. But that letter from Adana, it made me realize that my life is empty. Completely empty. And maybe, just maybe, meeting you both will help me understand what I'm doing wrong." Chinelo blinked, clearly surprised by his frankness. Funke, who had been watching the interaction in silence, intervened gently. "Chinelo, he's being sincere. I've worked with Adebayo for years. He's many things, but he's not a liar." Chinelo looked at her sister, then back at Adebayo. Something in her expression softened just slightly. "All right, you can meet Adana, but with one condition. If she doesn't feel comfortable with you, this ends here. I won't force my daughter to accept someone's presence just because I decided to give them a chance." Adebayo nodded immediately. "I understand perfectly, and I agree." Chinelo held his gaze for another moment, then turned towards the school entrance. "Let's go then." The performance starts in 20 minutes. They walked in together, Funke in the middle, playing the role of a bridge between two uncomfortable strangers. The school playground was decorated with Christmas ornaments made by the children themselves, chains of colored paper, drawings of Father Christmas, and reindeer stuck on the walls. There were tables with homemade cakes, small chops, and large bottles of soft drinks. Families milled about excitedly, children running between the laughing adults. It was chaotic, noisy, completely different from any environment Adebayo frequented. And strangely, he didn't feel out of place. He felt curious. Chinelo led them to a quieter corner near the small, makeshift stage. Adana is backstage with the other children from the choir. They'll be performing in a few minutes. Adebayo nodded, his heart racing. A young teacher got on stage and picked up a crackling microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Christmas party. Now, we will have a special performance from the Primary 3 Children's Choir." Enthusiastic applause. The children started to file onto the stage, all wearing red t-shirts and makeshift Father Christmas hats. Adebayo scanned the group with his eyes, searching without knowing exactly for what. Then he saw her. Adana was almost in the middle of the line, a small girl with wavy brown hair tied in 2 pigtails, with large, expressive eyes. She looked nervous, adjusting the hat that kept slipping. Chinelo, beside Adebayo, whispered, "That's her, the one in the middle with the crooked hat." Adebayo couldn't answer, couldn't take his eyes off the girl. The choir began to sing a childish version of Joy to the World, their voices off-key but full of enthusiasm. Adana sang with concentration, her lips moving exaggeratedly to form each word. There was an adorable seriousness on her face, as if this performance was the most important thing in the world. Adebayo felt something tighten in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name. That was the girl who had written the letter. That small, serious child had asked Father Christmas for a father, and somehow that request had reached him. He glanced at Chinelo, who was watching her daughter with a proud smile and slightly misty eyes. There was so much love there, so much fierce devotion. Chinelo was mother and father at the same time, giving her all to fill that empty space. The song ended with warm applause. The children descended from the stage in a rush, running towards their families. Adana looked for her mother with her eyes, and upon finding her, ran in her direction. "Mummy, did you see? I didn't forget any part." Chinelo bent down and hugged her daughter, kissing the top of her head. "I saw, my love. You were perfect." It was then that Adana noticed Adebayo. She blinked, confused, looking from the stranger to her mother. "Who is he?" Chinelo took a deep breath. "Adana, this is Adebayo. He's a friend of Auntie Funk's. He came to see your school." Adana studied Adebayo with the brutal frankness of children. "Hello." Adebayo crouched down to her level, an instinct he didn't even know he possessed. "Hello, Adana. You sang very well." Adana smiled shyly. "Thank you. I was nervous." Adebayo smiled back. "It didn't seem like it. You were very brave." There was a silence as Adana assessed him, deciding whether he was safe or not. Then she asked, "Do you work with Auntie Funke?" Adebayo nodded. "Yes, I do." Adana tilted her head. "Are you a nice person?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Adebayo couldn't help a genuine laugh. "I don't know. I hope I am." Adana seemed to consider this, then shrugged. "Okay, do you want to see my drawing? It's over there on the wall." She pointed to one of the many children's drawings taped up. Before Adebayo could answer, Adana had already taken his hand and was pulling him towards the wall. Adebayo let himself be led, feeling the small, warm hand in his. Chinelo watched everything with an unreadable expression, still not convinced, but clearly surprised by how easily Adana had accepted Adebayo. Funke smiled discreetly. Adana stopped in front of a colorful drawing of a Christmas tree surrounded by presents. "This is mine. I drew me and my mummy opening presents." Adebayo observed the drawing carefully. There were 2 female figures, one large and one small. Both were smiling. "It's very beautiful. You draw well." Adana beamed at the compliment. "Do you have children?" The question echoed Chinelo's, but coming from Adana, it had a different weight. "I don't." Adana looked at him thoughtfully. "Why?" Adebayo didn't have a simple answer for that. "I haven't met the right people yet," he finally said, a truth more honest than he intended. Adana nodded as if that made all the sense in the world. "Auntie Funke says the right things happen at the right time." Adebayo smiled. "Your auntie is a wise woman." Adana let go of his hand and ran back to Chinelo. "Mummy, can I have some cake?" Chinelo nodded, still watching Adebayo with that mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "You can, love, but only one piece." Adana ran off towards the table of sweets. Chinelo approached Adebayo, her voice low. She likes you. Adana isn't like this with strangers. Adebayo didn't know if that was a good thing or a scary thing. Maybe both. She's special, he said. And it was the absolute truth. Chinelo softened just a little. Yes, she is. She's my everything. And Adebayo, looking at that strong woman and that vibrant little girl, understood that he was at the beginning of something that would change everything. The following weeks brought a routine that Adebayo had never imagined for himself. It started subtly, almost accidentally. On the Sunday after the school party, Funke called, asking if he would like to join them at the park. Chinelo had agreed, with the caveat that it would just be a walk, nothing compromising. Adebayo accepted before he had even fully processed the invitation. At the park, Adana ran ahead while the three adults walked in an initially uncomfortable silence. It was Adana who broke the tension, running back to take Adebayo's hand and drag him towards the swings. Chinelo watched from a distance, her arms crossed, but she didn't stop it. That became a pattern. Adana opened doors that Chinelo still kept locked. Adebayo discovered he didn't know how to talk to a 7-year-old. His first attempts were disastrous generic questions about school that Adana answered with bored monosyllables. It was only when he stopped trying and just started listening that things changed. Adana talked about cartoons he had never watched, about her best friend who swapped stickers with her, about the neighbor's dog that barked all night. Adebayo absorbed every detail as if he were studying a completely new universe, and he was. Adana's universe was made of simple things he had learned to ignore: the taste of strawberry ice cream, the importance of wearing matching socks, the joy of finding a pretty stone on the ground. Chinelo remained distant but observant. Adebayo constantly felt the weight of her gaze, evaluating his every gesture, every word. He didn't blame her. If he were in her shoes, he would be just as cautious about a stranger entering his daughter's life. But there were brief, rare moments when Chinelo let her guard down, like when Adana told a bad joke, and Adebayo laughed genuinely, making Chinelo smile for the first time. Or when he brought children's books he had carefully researched and saw Chinelo's eyes soften when she realized he had actually paid attention to Adana's tastes. They were small victories, but Adebayo had learned to value them. With Chinelo, everything had to be earned slowly. A month after their first meeting, Chinelo finally agreed to let Adebayo visit them at home. The small house where they lived was in a simple neighborhood, with a narrow street and houses packed together. Adebayo parked his car 2 streets away, a precaution to avoid drawing attention with his imported vehicle. The house had 2 bedrooms, a small living room integrated with the kitchen, and a tiny backyard at the back. It was modest but impeccably clean, with simple decor that prioritized functionality. There were Adana's drawings everywhere, stuck on the fridge, framed on the wall, spread across the table. The whole house smelled of fresh coffee and homemade cake. Adebayo felt a pang of something. He took a moment to identify as envy, not for the house itself, but for the warmth it exuded. His luxury apartment was 10 times larger and 1,000 times emptier. Adana proudly showed him her room, a small space, but full of personality. Walls painted lilac, a bed with unicorn sheets, a wobbly shelf full of books and toys organized with care. "Mummy says I need to donate some toys because there's no more space," Adana explained. "But I like all of them." Adebayo looked at the toys. None were particularly expensive or sophisticated, but all were clearly loved. There were repaired stuffed animals, books with worn-out covers from being read so often. Everything there told a story of care, of a mother doing her best with what she had. Adebayo felt a tightness in his chest. He could easily buy Adana anything she wanted, but that would be wrong, he realized. It would be imposing his world on hers, disrespecting the balance Chinelo had built with so much effort. Chinelo prepared a simple lunch: rice, stew, roasted chicken, and salad. Nothing fancy, but made with care. They ate at the small table in the living room, Adana chattering non-stop about her art class that day. Adebayo realized it was the first time in years he had eaten a home-cooked meal at a real table, surrounded by people. He usually ate alone, food delivered in plastic containers, distracted by his phone. This was different. There was conversation, laughter, even a small argument when Adana tried to negotiate less salad on her plate. It was messy and noisy and completely perfect. Adebayo found himself watching Chinelo as she cut Adana's chicken into smaller pieces, a gesture so natural and affectionate that it hurt to watch. After lunch, Adana asked to watch a film. Chinelo agreed but warned that she had tests to mark. Adebayo immediately offered to help, without thinking. Chinelo raised an eyebrow. "Do you know anything about primary 3 maths?" Adebayo smiled. "I can learn." Chinelo studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. But don't go easy on the marking. These children need to learn properly. Adebayo agreed, and so he found himself sitting at the table with Chinelo, marking maths tests while Adana watched a film in the living room. It was surreally domestic. They worked in companionable silence, just the sound of the film in the background and the rustling of papers. Can I ask you something? Chinelo said suddenly, without taking her eyes off the test she was marking. Adebayo looked up. Of course. Chinelo paused, as if weighing her words. Why are you really here, Adebayo? And don't give me that answer about your life being empty. I want to understand what a man like you wants with a family like ours. Adebayo put his pen down on the table, knowing this moment would eventually come. I've spent my whole life building things, he began, choosing each word. I built a company from scratch. I built a reputation. I built a fortune. But I never built anything that really mattered. I never built real connections. I never really let anyone in. Chinelo finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. And you think we're going to fill that void? There was no accusation in her voice, just genuine curiosity. Adebayo shook his head. No, I'm not here to use you as a personal redemption project. I'm here because, for the first time in a long time, I feel something. When I'm with Adana, when I'm near you, I remember who I was before I got lost along the way. And maybe, just maybe, being around you both will help me find my way back. Chinelo processed that in silence. And what if it doesn't work? What if you find out this isn't what you expected and decide to leave? Adana is already attached to you, Adebayo. I see how she talks about you during the week. If you disappear now, you'll hurt her. Chinelo's brutal honesty was both refreshing and frightening. I'm not going to disappear, Adebayo said, and it was the most sincere truth he knew. I know you have no reason to believe me. I know Adana's father made promises and broke them all, but I'm not him, Chinelo. I don't make promises I can't keep, and I'm promising you now. I will not abandon Adana. I will not abandon you. Chinelo held his gaze for a long moment, searching for lies, searching for flaws. Then, something in her expression changed, softened. I want to believe you, she admitted quietly, but it's hard. It's very hard to trust again. Adebayo nodded. I know. And I'm not asking for your trust now. I'm asking for a chance to earn it. Slowly. In your own time. Chinelo returned her attention to the tests, but Adebayo saw the ghost of a smile on her lips. It was progress. Slow, cautious, but real. They went back to marking in silence, but something had changed in the air. Less tension, more openness. When they finished, Adana was already asleep on the sofa, the film still playing on the television. Marina stood up to turn it off, and Adebayo watched her move around the room, picking up a blanket to cover her daughter. There was a grace in those gestures, a fierce tenderness that Chinelo perhaps didn't even notice. Adebayo found himself wondering what it would be like to be included in that routine, not as a visitor, but as a part of it. The thought was both terrifying and deeply appealing. I should go, Adebayo said quietly, not wanting to wake Adana. Chinelo nodded. They walked to the door in silence. Before Adebayo left, Chinelo touched his arm lightly. Thank you for today, for trying. Adebayo covered her hand with his, a brief but significant touch. Thank you for letting me try. He stepped out into the cool night, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in the quiet street. Adebayo got into his car but didn't start the engine immediately. He just sat there, watching the small house, a yellow light leaking through the curtains. Within those simple walls, there was more life, more warmth, more meaning than in his entire luxurious apartment. And for the first time, Adebayo allowed himself to imagine a different future, a future where he wasn't alone. The following weeks brought a routine that Adebayo had never dreamed of, but which had now become essential. He spent weekends with Chinelo and Adana, sometimes just simple outings, sometimes lunch at their house. Adebayo learned to make pancakes because Adana mentioned she loved them for breakfast. He learned to play noughts and crosses and to assemble jigsaw puzzles. He learned that Adana was afraid of thunder and that Chinelo sang softly to calm her down. He learned the small details that made up their universe, and with each discovery, his own world expanded a little more. Adebayo no longer felt like he was just existing. Now he was beginning to truly live, and it was all because of a child's letter that had reached him when he needed it most, even without him knowing it. Chinelo was also changing, bit by bit. Their conversations became longer, deeper. She told him about her lonely pregnancy, about the terror of raising a child alone, about the nights she cried in the shower so Adana wouldn't hear. Adebayo just listened, without offering solutions or unsolicited advice. Sometimes, all Chinelo needed was to be heard, to be seen, to be validated. Adebayo understood that. He had spent years being listened to professionally, but never personally. No one really saw him. Chinelo saw him. She saw through the facade of the successful entrepreneur and found the lost man underneath. And strangely, Adebayo wasn't afraid of that penetrating gaze. For the first time, he wanted to be seen completely, flaws and all. December advanced quickly, and with it came the approach of Christmas. Adana talked constantly about the date. Excited about the decorations Chinelo had already started putting up around the house. One afternoon, while helping to hang ornaments on the small artificial tree, Adana asked, "Adebayo, what are you going to do for Christmas?" Adebayo realized he had no plans. He never did. Christmas had always been just another day, spent alone with some takeaway food and accumulated work. "I haven't decided yet," he answered honestly. Adana looked at him with those big, serious eyes. "You could spend Christmas here with us." Chinelo froze, her hands suspended in the air, holding an ornament. She looked at Adana, then at Adebayo. "Adana, maybe Adebayo already has other plans." But Adebayo interrupted. "Actually, I would love that, if you'll have me." Chinelo studied him, something unreadable passing through her eyes. Then she smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "It would be nice to have you here." And Adebayo knew in that moment that this would be the first of many Christmases he hoped to spend exactly there. Christmas morning dawned with that humid heat typical of December in Lagos, the blue sky competing with sparse clouds that promised rain in the afternoon. Adebayo woke up early in his apartment, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the loneliness that always accompanied this day. Today would be different. Today he had somewhere to go. He had people waiting for him. He dressed carefully, choosing casual clothes that Chinelo would approve of, and picked up the presents he had bought with meticulous attention. For Adana, a collection of books on astronomy after she mentioned wanting to learn about the stars. For Chinelo, a set of professional watercolors, something he had discovered by chance when Funke commented that her sister loved to paint but never had the money for decent materials. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that looked like charity, just gifts chosen with care by someone who paid attention. Adebayo arrived at their house shortly after 10 a.m., his hands sweating slightly as he rang the bell. Adana opened the door, already wearing a new red dress, her eyes shining with excitement. "Adebayo, you came!" She jumped into his arms without hesitation, and Adebayo caught her in a hug with a naturalness that surprised him. Months ago, he wouldn't have even known how to hold a child. Now it was automatic, instinctive. Chinelo appeared right behind, wearing a simple floral cotton dress, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders. She looked beautiful, in a way that made Adebayo's heart race. "Good morning," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "Merry Christmas, Chinelo," Adebayo replied, setting Adana down. Their hands touched briefly in the transfer, an electric contact that neither of them commented on, but both felt. The house was decorated with charming simplicity. The small artificial tree glowed with colorful lights, modest presents piled underneath. There was a smell of fried rice and chicken in the air. Funke was already there, helping Chinelo in the kitchen, and she waved cheerfully at Adebayo. The morning unfolded in a succession of warm moments, a shared breakfast. Adana opening presents with squeals of joy, Chinelo blushing when she saw the watercolors and insisting that Adebayo shouldn't have spent so much. Though her eyes betrayed her emotion, Adebayo received a framed drawing from Adana of her, Chinelo, and himself, the three figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Something inside him broke and pieced itself back together at the same time, looking at that drawing. He was included. He belonged in that picture. After lunch, Funke made an excuse about needing to pick something up from her house and left discreetly, leaving the three of them alone. Adana, tired from the morning's excitement, dozed off on the sofa. Chinelo and Adebayo found themselves on the small back veranda, watching the sky that was beginning to darken with the promised rain clouds. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, just the distant sound of cars and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was Chinelo who spoke first, her voice low and charged with emotion. "I need to tell you something." Adebayo turned to her, his heart tightening. Chinelo took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "When Adana's father left me, something inside me broke. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the way he did it. As if I was a mistake, as if our daughter was an unwanted burden. I swore I would never again let anyone have the power to hurt me like that." Adebayo listened in silence, knowing she needed to say this. For 7 years, I kept that vow. I closed my heart. I focused only on Adana, on surviving, on being strong. I convinced myself that I didn't need anyone, that the two of us were enough. Chinelo finally looked at Adebayo, and her eyes were moist. And then you showed up with that absurd story about finding Adana's letter, wanting to meet her for no apparent reason. I thought you would get tired of it, that it was just temporary curiosity, that in a few weeks you would realize this was too complicated and disappear like everyone else. She paused, discreetly wiping away a tear. But you didn't disappear. You came back, and you came back, and you came back. You learned to make pancakes because Adana mentioned she liked them. You spend hours assembling jigsaw puzzles when you could be anywhere else. You look at my daughter as if she's precious. As if we are precious. Adebayo took a step towards her, his voice hoarse with emotion. You are precious. You are the most important people who have ever come into my life. Chinelo sobbed quietly. I'm in love with you, Adebayo, and it terrifies me. Because if you leave now, it won't just break Adana's heart, it will break mine too, completely. Adebayo didn't think, he just acted. He pulled Chinelo into his arms, wrapping her in a tight hug. She let herself go, burying her face in his chest as silent tears streamed down. Adebayo kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. I'm not going anywhere, he murmured against her hair. Chinelo, I am completely in love with you, with Adana, with this life you've shown me. You saved me without even knowing it. You saved me from an empty existence I used to call a life. Chinelo lifted her face, her red-rimmed eyes shining. Are you sure? Because it's not just romance, Adebayo. It's waking up early to take Adana to school. It's dealing with tantrums and homework. It's sharing space and time and life. It's real and messy and difficult. Adebayo smiled, wiping the tears from her face with his thumbs. I want all of it. I want to wake up early and argue about homework. I want to share a space with you. I want to build something real, something that matters. Chinelo studied him, looking for doubt, for fear. She found only certainty. Then she smiled, a shaky but genuine smile. And Adebayo knew he was seeing Chinelo without her barriers for the first time. It was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. She didn't. Their lips met in a soft kiss, laden with unspoken promises and possible futures. When they parted, they were both smiling. Chinelo rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. This is crazy, she whispered. It's the best kind of crazy I've ever committed to, Adebayo replied. They walked back inside hand in hand, finding Adana awake and rubbing her eyes. She looked at them, then at their intertwined hands, and her face lit up with childish understanding. Are you two dating? The question was so direct that Chinelo laughed, still wiping away the remnants of her tears. Yes, my love, we are. Adana jumped off the sofa and ran to hug both of their legs. I knew it. I asked Father Christmas, and he sent you. She looked up at Adebayo with those big eyes. Will you stay for real? Adebayo crouched down to her level, holding her small hands. I will stay, Adana. Forever, if you'll have me. Adana didn't respond with words, just threw herself into his arms, squeezing him tight. Adebayo held her, feeling her small, perfect weight against his chest, feeling Chinelo kneel beside them and wrap them both in her arms. There, in that tight embrace in the small living room of that simple house, Adebayo found everything he had always been searching for without knowing it. He found belonging, he found family, he found home. The first drops of rain began to fall outside, drumming softly on the roof. Adana lifted her head. Can I show Adebayo my new books? Chinelo smiled. You can, love. Adana took Adebayo's hand and dragged him towards the bedroom, chattering excitedly about stars and planets. Adebayo looked back one last time, meeting Chinelo's gaze. She was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching with a smile that said everything. Later, when Adana had finally fallen asleep after a full day of excitement, Adebayo and Chinelo found themselves on the veranda again. The rain had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. They sat side by side on the steps, their shoulders touching. What happens now? Chinelo asked quietly. Adebayo took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Now we build. Slowly, our way, in our own time. I don't want to rush anything. I want to do this right. I want to earn Adana's trust completely. I want you to be absolutely sure of me. Chinelo squeezed his hand. I'm already sure. It took a while, but I am. Adebayo smiled. Even so, let's take it slow. I'll be here whenever you need me. I'll be here even when you don't. I'll be here. That's a promise. Chinelo rested her head on his shoulder. You know my life is complicated, right? I don't earn much. I live far away. I have a daughter who will need constant attention. Adebayo chuckled softly. Chinelo, I spend 60 hours a week in meetings about numbers on spreadsheets. Your life isn't complicated. Your life is real, and it's exactly what I need." They sat there, just existing together in the comfortable silence, until Chinelo yawned. "I should go to sleep. I have an early start tomorrow." Adebayo stood up and helped her to her feet. At the door, before leaving, he pulled her in for one more kiss, this one longer, deeper, filled with all the promises that were yet to be fulfilled. "Merry Christmas, Chinelo," he whispered against her lips. "Merry Christmas, Adebayo," she replied, smiling. Adebayo drove back home under the starry sky that had opened up after the rain. But now his apartment was no longer home. Home was in that small house, with its colorful walls, full of children's drawings and overflowing with love. Home was with Chinelo and Adana, and for the first time in his life, Adebayo Adeleke knew exactly where he belonged. Adana's letter had asked Father Christmas for a father, one who would stay and like them. And the universe, in its strange wisdom, had sent that letter to Adebayo, exactly when he most needed to be found. It wasn't he who had saved Adana and Chinelo. It was they who had saved him. And now, together, they would build something beautiful, something real, something that none of them had ever fully had, but had always desired. A true family. Imperfect, but absolutely theirs. And that, Adebayo knew, looking at the stars as he drove, was more than enough.